Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a couple of firsts here at the Breakdown, and this is for a couple of different reasons. So first of all, we are, as always, and as we have been for a couple of months now, doing our weekly roundup of the biggest stories in Alberta politics live on Twitter Spaces. But we're upping our game a little bit, and we've been threatening to do this for a while. We're finally giving it a try tonight. And what I'm talking about here is we're actually live streaming, hopefully, if everything's working the way that it's supposed to, we're actually live streaming to YouTube right now as well. As always, if you have any feedback, if you have any comments, please feel free to jump in on the Twitter Spaces as well. We do have for our patrons, we do have our Discord server. So if you have questions or if you have something that you want to add through there, by all means, please do. And finally, I'm told that there is a chat for YouTube as well. So if you're somebody who wants to follow along or watch on YouTube, then you can. And last but not least, we also have the podcast version of this, which some of you may well be listening to, that is going to be available later tonight, which is June 12th. And if you're listening to that, thank you for that as well. It has been a dissonant week in Alberta politics, and the reason why I'm saying that is there have been a lot of stories that have been going on, but at the same time, things seem oddly quiet, and a lot of people are interpreting it as the calm before the storm that we would expect to see coming up with the UCP leadership race. There are 7 candidates who have announced their intention to run for the UCP leadership or have soft announced their intention to run for the UCP leadership. It's a very strange race because people are registering for the race with Elections Alberta, and then there's other people who haven't yet. So there's the 5 candidates who have registered on Elections Alberta, but there's also Leela here has announced that she's going to be running for the leadership, and reportedly Rajan Sani will also be announcing allegedly tomorrow that she'll be running for the UCP leadership as well. There's been a lot of sort of soft messaging, softening the ground in order to prep things for Rajan to make her announcement. So it would be very surprising if she didn't, but she hasn't done anything official yet. So we'll see what we see. But it seems like that's going to be the big storm that we're looking at over the next little while in Alberta politics, especially with the legislative session wrapping up early. But as always, there's still plenty of stuff going on. We're going to talk about that. So the first story that we have tonight is the Alberta Teachers Association barely ratified a vote to accept the mediated contract proposal that they had been given. For those of you that have been paying attention for a little while, there has been a lot of controversy over that contract because the people, the teachers, the Alberta Teachers Association had said, hey, there's some things that we'd really like to see included. And one of those big things was classroom sizes and addressing the classroom conditions that both teachers and students are having to work under. Well, the employer's body, it's called TIBA, they said, absolutely not. We're not going to have any kind of a conversation to do with the classroom conditions. It's not going to happen. Don't even think about it. The mediator took a look at the 2 positions and said, yeah, nobody's going to budge on this, so it is what it is. We're just going to have to let it go, and we'll have the contract based on these things. So teachers were put in the really unenviable position of having to decide whether or not to accept a contract that gave them a very, very small raise over a not insignificant amount of time, or if they decided to double down and try to say, no, we really want these classroom pieces to be dealt with. Now, from a PR standpoint, it was an absolute nightmare of a situation because there's bargaining going on right now where some employees in the public sector are being told, yeah, you know what, you're not even going to get a raise. We're going for rollbacks. We're going to take money away from you. We're going to decrease your wage. And that has been an ongoing thing. So it would have been very, very easy for the government to spin a negative story on teachers where they're saying, those teachers, we tried to meet you middle ground. They wouldn't do it. We even tried to give them a raise. They wouldn't take it. What are you going to do? So it would have been very, very hard for teachers to be able to address the classroom size the way that they had been positioned by the people who were doing the bargaining. At the end of the day, they voted to accept the mediated contract by just a hair. 51.1% of teachers voted to accept the contract. Now, there's two things that I think are really important to emphasize about this. The first one is clearly there were a lot of teachers who were very, very torn. This wasn't an overwhelming decision one way or the other for teachers. But on the other side of the scale, it's also very clear that this was a very, very difficult decision. There were some teachers who were having to choose between potentially facing a strike situation and not being able to provide for their families, or continuing to try to fight to get something into the contract that their employer said they were never going to include anyways. So it was a really difficult position for teachers. Bottom line is this. A, nobody should be dunking on teachers for them making an incredibly difficult decision. And B, this only underscores, and the fact that the employers group wasn't willing to discuss classroom conditions, this only underscores how important it is that Albertans speak up and say, you know what, this is not acceptable. Our kids should not be learning in classroom sizes of 40 and up. Our kids should not be learning in classrooms or in conditions where there aren't even classrooms available. We've seen plenty of news reports where students have been going out into hallways and going out into rotunda areas because there was no space available. So this is something that we're going to have to continue to advocate for. And as we're heading into a UCP leadership race, and we're seeing certainly some members who are running for the UCP leadership definitely doing everything they can to give themselves a soft social stance and not the hardline social conservative stance, but a more progressive stance, it's important that we make sure that this is one of the issues that people are talking about, because it's not going to go away. Our second story of the week has to do with the provincial police force. I had to take a quick drink there. One of the things that we've been seeing a lot with the conversation around the provincial police force is there are politicians and pundits who really, really seem to want this, despite the fact that Albertans don't. There's been lots of polling done, and there's lots of evidence that says this is not a hill that Albertans are willing to die on. But we keep seeing politicians talking about it like it's the most important issue facing Albertans. Never mind the cost of living. Never mind the fact that we've got these issues going on in education and healthcare. These guys really want to talk about the provincial police force. And maybe it's just because they don't want to talk about those other things. But at the end of the day, one of the things that we saw this week is Tyler Shandro invoked Coaldale as an example of why we absolutely have to have some sort of provincial police force option, because the RCMP, and the feds, they're just screwing everybody. And his example of this, as I said, was Coaldale. Now, why did he choose Coaldale? Because right now, the federal government doesn't kick in any of the funds that they would for any of the other areas that are policed by RCMP. So the town of Coaldale has to pay for all of the costs of having the RCMP police them instead of the 70% that most other municipalities do. Now, the question that you have to ask is why? And there's actually a really good explanation for that. It was in 2015. No, sorry, in 2004, trying to watch too many screens here. Like I said, first week doing this. It was in 2004 that the town of Coaldale decided that they were going to move away from using the RCMP, and they instead switched to Lethbridge. And one of the things that happened with that is they stayed with the Lethbridge police from 2004 till 2015, but in 2015, they then switched back to the RCMP. Now, there had since been rules in place saying that one of the things that was going on is the provincial police force, sorry, not the provincial police force, too many things going on. One of the things that was going on is the federal government said, hey, you know what? It's not cool for people to try to jump around and shop policing and maybe set up their own municipal police force, and then maybe switch back to the RCMP, and then maybe it doesn't make any sense. So instead, it makes more sense to just pull the trigger and say, if you leave with the RCMP, you're responsible for all the costs. And the town of Coaldale chose to do that. So it's really bizarre that Tyler Shandro is choosing to use a example that demonstrates reasons why you shouldn't get rid of the RCMP, because in the end of the day, it's going to end up costing more if you want to switch back to them. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Our third big story of the week has to do with something that we've already been talking about here at the Breakdown for a good chunk of the week. And that's a letter that was sent by 15 Constituency Association presidents and Constituency Association vice presidents of the NDP that said, hey, we've got a bit of a problem here. There's this, we keep hearing about this toxicity and the way that political staffers are treating, the way that they're treating volunteers, the way that they're treating constituency associations. Now, this goes back quite a ways. And we're going to be getting into this week with 2 more episodes on this subject, just how far back it goes, because it goes back a lot farther than you might think. But one thing that's becoming abundantly clear is that if you want to be involved with a political party, if you want to have any say, your loyalty has to be absolute, and it has to be pretty much blind. You have to be willing to do whatever the party wants. You have to be willing to say whatever the party wants. And if you ever question it, then you've worked your way onto some sort of a list where you're not trusted anymore. And that's a real problem for a lot of reasons. But worse than that, the way that volunteers are being treated by some of these staffers and by some of these higher ups is really quite offensive. And there have been allegations that it's abusive. Now, the letter called on the NDP to basically set up an independent review into complaints. Because right now, as we heard in our conversation with Krista Lee, and as we're going to hear in conversations over the next few weeks, well, actually over the next week, we're going to hear that if you want to make a complaint, you're very likely complaining to the person that you're wanting to make a complaint about. There's no independent review structure. And even this letter, it was reported, has been out there for 3 months at least. And nothing has been reported to have been done. This is a really big problem for a party that claims to be about the people, that claims to be about the grassroots. We saw Rachel Notley just this week did an interview with Rick Bell where she talked about the importance of populism of all things, because with that, you know from the people, you hear from the people when you're doing something wrong. And yet we've seen people come forward multiple times, not just over the last few months, but literally over years, raising concerns about the toxicity of the climate inside political parties. And I need to be really clear. As much as I'm talking about the NDP right now, the news cycle over the last couple of years has been largely dominated by stories about the toxic environment inside of the UCP. And there's a much bigger conversation to be had about what are we gonna do about this? What can we do about this? Now, we've got 2 more episodes coming up about this exact issue. The first one is another interview with another person who shares very, very similar concerns with what Krista shared with us. But the third piece that we're doing, because there's 3 parts to this series that we're doing, the third piece is actually a conversation with some of the people who would know best what these problems are. Because they've been at the highest levels of some of these provincial parties. This is a panel that we put together, and it absolutely blows my mind, the people that appear on this panel. And I say that because there's going to be some people who look at this panel, they're going to look at some of the names on this panel, and they're going to go, holy cow! You're letting this person on your show, or you're letting this person on your show? But the bottom line is the reason why this panel and the diversity of views that we're going to see on it is so significant is because we have people from both arguably extreme ends of the political spectrum who agreed to come on. It's an hour and a half long conversation to talk about why these things are broken. And most importantly, what are some of the things that we can do to address it? I'm really excited to get this episode out there, as you can tell, because I've been talking about it nonstop. So it's probably time that we move on to our fourth story. And this is a really good example of performative politics, let's say. So Jason Nixon, who by most measures is now the minister of everything, I guess. Well, he's Parks and Recreation and Finance, which is terrifying for a whole bunch of different reasons, depending on what your perspective is. But he put out a letter where he invited the NDP energy critic, Kathleen Ganley, to join him in his call to Ottawa to say that the federal government needs to suspend the carbon tax and it needs to suspend the GST on gasoline prices. Because if you've driven in the last week, you know that gasoline prices have gone through the absolute roof. We're now getting very, very close. And in some areas of the city, in Calgary, we reportedly have broken the $2 mark. There's lots of people who are incredibly frustrated about this, especially going into summer, where it's the primary time for travel and tourism. And there's a lot of people who are saying it's going to affect their ability to support the Alberta economy through travel and tourism because they just can't afford to pay for the gas to get places. But Jason Nixon invited Kathleen Ganley to please, let's be nonpartisan or some such nonsense, and fight Ottawa together. But here's the thing. First of all, there are a lot of Albertans who are only getting by with the current cost of living because they get a carbon tax rebate. Getting rid or suspending the carbon tax would mean that those people presumably wouldn't be getting the carbon tax rebate. And when you think about the fact that a lot of the people who get the carbon tax rebate are some of the people who need it the most, that's a pretty big deal. So what Mr. Nixon was arguably arguing for was removal of financial supports for a lot of people. Because it's important to realize that for a lot of people, they actually end up making more off of the carbon tax rebates than they do paying the carbon tax. So to say, let's just get rid of that, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's clearly performative. But it also begs the question, or not begs the question, I always misuse that phrase. It also forces the question, if Jason Nixon is so concerned about making lives easier for Albertans, why haven't they done, and why didn't they do, any of the things that they could have done when they had the legislative session? The easiest example of this is they talked a lot about providing relief for natural gas prices. That was a big thing that they talked about a whole bunch all the way through the legislative session. We're going to do this. It's going to be great. And then they didn't. And it seems like one of the reasons why they didn't provide that immediate relief is because they knew summer was coming. And for a lot of people, they were going to see the natural gas portion of their bill drop anyways because it's warmer, which is an incredibly cynical approach to trying to provide relief to people who need it. This is one of the reasons why it's so important that people are engaged in politics and paying attention to politics, because what Mr. Nixon was trying to do there was not only polarize people against his political opponents, but he was also grossly misrepresenting the program and its impact to score cheap points against the enemy of Ottawa. This is what people should be demanding better from. And this is coming from a minister who is currently occupying not one, but two portfolios. Our last story of... before I move on to the last story, the other thing I want to say is, can we just talk about for a sec about what the UCP could have done for insurance caps? Because they've had plenty of opportunity to institute caps that would have protected people. When you take a look at what families are paying for insurance right now, when you combine car insurance and when you combine house insurance, for a lot of Albertans, even with just one car, they're looking at almost $500 a month. And this is when insurance companies have been reaping huge profits. They could have done something about that, but they didn't. So, again, performative at its worst. Our last story has to do with the situation of crime. So one of the things that has come up in a lot of conversation recently has to do with the situation for crime in municipalities across Alberta. Many people are aware of the recent tragic events in Edmonton where 2 people were bludgeoned to death. That story has only gotten more tragic and more reprehensible, given the fact that the person who is accused of committing those crimes is somebody who wasn't even supposed to be in Edmonton in the first place and was in fact delivered to Edmonton by the RCMP despite there being bail conditions. Sorry, not bail conditions, but release conditions that said he wasn't allowed in Edmonton, despite the fact that he was removed from where he was because he was reportedly escalating in violence towards the people around him. So the RCMP dumped him in Edmonton. He crossed paths with the Edmonton police, and they let him go. This was a tragic and preventable thing, and it's heartbreaking. And it's something that a lot of people are very upset about with good reason. But again, it's another thing that we've seen the current Justice Minister doing everything he can to get as much airtime and outrage out of as he possibly can. And it hasn't been representative of what's actually going on in the province. How do we know this? Because the Global Crime Index was just released. And there are 2 cities in Alberta that ranked on that Global Crime Index. Neither Edmonton nor Calgary were in the top 100. In fact, Lethbridge rated number 56, and Red Deer was number 67. Now, some of you might remember, shortly after the tragic events in Edmonton, Tyler Shandro came out and he used the Power of the Police Act to demand that the city of Edmonton provide him a plan to get the rampant crime under control. But Edmonton's crime rate, according to the Global Crime Index, isn't as bad as Lethbridge. It isn't as bad as Red Deer. This is the same government that condemned the feds for invoking the Emergency Act during the occupation of the Coutts border crossing, where there were people there who were planning to kill cops. This is the same government that condemned the feds for using that same Emergencies Act to deal with an occupation in the streets of Ottawa, where homeless shelters were being violent scenes because the people who were occupying were coming in and demanding food and harassing houseless people. But now we have Tyler Shandro, instead of dealing with these 2 other cities that have much higher crime issues, now he's going after Edmonton. It's almost as if there's a provincial election coming up and the UCP only have 1 seat in Edmonton. Because it certainly doesn't seem like it's based on actual evidence or data. It certainly seems like it's more of a grudge issue from a minister who, when he was health minister, showed up in a physician's driveway to berate him about a meme that was posted on the internet. A health minister who does still have hearings pending for not only that, but for the fact that he threatened to sick the legislative law enforcement branch on somebody who had written to his wife expressing concerns about a conflict of interest that he replied to from his legislative account when he's supposed to be at an arm's length trust with that company. There's a lot of questions, but the one thing that seems to be absolutely clear is it doesn't have very much to do with addressing the actual crime in the province, and it certainly doesn't seem to have anything to do with addressing the underlying issues that drive these sorts of crimes. We saw a government this week that decided to talk about the fact that it was going to make policing a central figure in addressing mental health and addictions issues, as opposed to proper preventative measures and proper preventative supports. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of people that are falling through the cracks unnecessarily. And we have a government that has shut down supervised consumption sites in this province under false pretense. It forces a lot of questions. Those are our top 5 stories. There's a couple things, one more thing I want to mention real quick, because it is really important, and it was really quite shocking and alarming to me, and I'm surprised that more people, quite frankly, aren't talking about it. And it has to do with a report that was released by an agency out of the States. It was written by a Canadian, and it talks about the fact that right now, with all of the drilling that we're doing, we have oil companies that can't pay to remediate the drills they're drilling, even if the price of oil stays at $85 a barrel. This is a huge problem. The projections in that report include the fact that it could be up to $2 billion that is going to be added to the costs of remediating these wells. And there's these companies, and you can read about it in any of the oil boom news reports. You'll see people talking about the fact that there's oil companies that are taking advantage of this opportunity to make sure that their shareholders are getting the maximum amount possible back because it's been a dry couple of years. But in doing that, they're not setting aside the money that they need to remediate these oil sites. And that means there's a very high risk of those oil sites then getting kicked over to the taxpayer. The taxpayer is already on the hook for an alarming number of oil sites that have no longer, they're not being used anymore. But the ground and the area around the sites needs to be remediated. It needs to be cleaned up. The oil companies defaulted on those, and there's a huge inventory that the taxpayer is going to be on the hook for cleaning up. Well, the situation that we have right now is we are at risk of adding to that inventory in really, really big ways. And we're not doing enough to talk about it. And we're certainly not doing enough to demand from our financial institutions and from our governments, we got to get this thing under control, because we are writing a check that generations down the road won't be able to cash. That's it for this episode of The Breakdown. Sorry it was a little bit bumpy. We're trying to do some new things here. We talked about the fact that we were going to start trying to stream it. So we are trying to stream things. We'll see how it works out. As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here, you can sign up to be one of our Patreon sponsors at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab, where you get access to a bunch of different things, including our Discord, where you can say mean or nice things about us at your leisure. Price of a cup of coffee a month. And it makes a big difference. It helps us buy the equipment that we need to try to up our game with the streaming stuff. It helps us buy the equipment that we need to be able to do the kinds of interviews that we want to do ongoing. Again, I would really encourage you to check out the episode that we dropped about the orphan well situation. We dropped that on, I think it was Wednesday. If you haven't listened to it, it's a short one, but the Omar does a really good job of spelling out just how much trouble we're setting ourselves up for. Keep an eye out, because we're going to be dropping the part 2 of our series on the problems of political parties and the toxic culture inside of them. We're dropping part 2 on Tuesday, and then we are dropping our panel that is going to make everyone's head explode on Thursday. And I got to say about the episode that's coming up on Thursday, there are some moments in that episode that are really hard to watch. There are some moments in the conversation that are really heartbreaking and are profoundly, profoundly honest. And so when it comes out, I would really ask you to seriously consider listening. And I would even say, because of the emotion that we see from some of the participants in that panel, I would say watch it, because there's some really powerful stuff in there. Thanks again for tuning in on Twitter, everybody. Hopefully the live stream worked out. We'll find out after I click the off button. And have a good week and keep the conversation going.